Oh my gosh, students, the computer cut off just as I was finishing up this section on coping. So I think I was talking about helping a client with guided imagery. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about having to do with coping could be grounding, helping a client with the kinds of exercise that is, there's a lot of good information in your Moodle class page on grounding. There are scripts for grounding and other kinds of examples. So as I say grounding, I feel in my mind that I've taught this to you, but if it isn't really ringing as a memory, please go up into the class page until you find all the PDF files that I've attached excuse me, related to grounding, because they're very good and they're from a very good source. So I think that I was then, this is the part that got the camera turned off for, so I'm just going to redo it. It's helpful, of course, with clients who have experienced these kinds of personal traumas to use empowering statements and giving them a sense of being an empowered person versus being a victim. So here are some examples of empowering statements. You're strong to be here. You survived this. Getting help and talking about this is going to make you a survivor, and we're moving you from being a victim to a survivor. You can also suggest that the person practice self-care. And when I say self-care, I mean the person eating well, eating healthily if they can, a person taking care of their sleep, having good sleep hygiene. We can talk about what sleep hygiene means if the client doesn't know what that means. Also doing something for their spirit, doesn't have to be religious at all, but it can be making some statements about themselves, such as, you are an important spirit in this world, you are valuable, you are worthy of love. I don't know, other kinds of things related to that, those kinds of self-statements. And then engaging, also we can encourage a client to engage in something that's creative and pleasurable for them. And we can ask the client, are there things that you like to do that for relaxation or that are creative for you? In the most recent times that we're dealing with this coronavirus, somehow I went and got my old adult coloring books. I don't know if you've had those or seen those, but they're very detailed drawings, and people use, gel pens or colored pencils. And I actually took out some pages and cut them into small pieces, so they're almost like an index card. And when I'm sitting watching the news with my husband, I find that if I do some of that coloring, it's kind of relaxing for me. It's relieving some of the stress of hearing this news about the coronavirus. And this could be something that you could suggest to a client, or a client might do something else like whittle, or they might crochet, or they might garden or cook. And so this would be another category of taking care of oneself that you could emphasize would be really good for the client. I'm going to switch now to talk with you a little bit about date and acquaintance rape. And this is separated out as a sexual assault category because people who have had this experience have had a unique experience, really. And that is because they've maybe shared time with the person who has then become their attacker. So they might be, it might be a coworker that they've hung out with multiple times. It could be someone that they know through a community activity, somebody on their basketball team, or somebody from their church. And so there's a special kind of sense of being victimized by somebody that you know sort of socially. And it tends to lead to people wondering if, wow, did I give this person the wrong signal that I was interested in being intimate with them? And so there are some certain kind of particular reactions that can happen when somebody experiences date rape or acquaintance rape. Some of the emotions that a person can experience are feelings of guilt, as if they had caused it, or shame, as if their behavior was such that they were asking for it somehow. Or they just might feel like they were sending the wrong signal, that they misrepresented themselves to a person. So there's all this kind of questioning about, what did I do? Maybe I must have done something to make this person do this to me, which is not the case. You know, sexual assault or rape are just plain sexual assault and rape. And we need to help our clients feel that if they've experienced the crisis of this kind of victimization. So let's see, at some point, you know, a person may feel like they can't talk about this, or they're ashamed of it, or that their friends would blame them. Let's say you were with some friends at a party and one of your girlfriends went off with a guy and they were making out like people do, and you just thought, well, you know, you went off with him, you were drinking, you were partying, you know, what did you think was going to happen? And this is the kind of thing that stops our friends from talking to us about, you know, having the experience of a date rape. And so I think it's important for us as crisis interventionists to realize that sexual assault and rape have their own set of reactions. And then when a client comes to you in a crisis and they've experienced a date rape or an acquaintance rape or acquaintance sexual assault, this can have some unique sorts of blame, self-blame, and guilt feelings associated with it. All right, that is kind of ends on page 179 if you're following along with me in the textbook. I know some of you like to do that. Next, I'd like to just talk about child abuse, and there's a section, kind of a shorter section about child sexual abuse, and we'll talk about that too. But we kind of skip over in the textbook now to get to page 190 where this begins. So I'm flipping over several pages here, and again just want to say to you that most of the data that's reported related to this topic is from around 2013, 2014, just for reference for yourself. So if you look on page, I guess it's page 190, box 9.6, you're going to see a list of facts associated with child abuse. Sorry, I just stepped away for a moment there to close the door. And these, this is a bunch of bulleted facts about occurrence rates for the most part regarding child abuse. I think the main thing that you can take from this, there are all kinds of different numbers, reporting numbers there. They are very interesting to look at, but they don't really give you much of a frame of reference, actually. I think the main thing to take away from this topic is that it just happens. It happens more than we want to realize with children, and it shouldn't be something that you think you'll never have an experience working with. So the kinds of crises that I can imagine us dealing with, having to do with child abuse, might be that you're actually helping a parent who has just discovered that their child has experienced abuse. Maybe it's a parent who has been dating someone and they find out that their girlfriend or their boyfriend is abusing their own child, and the guilt and rage that can come from this, from not protecting your loved child, can be terrible, and it's a full-out crisis. Or you might end up somehow being engaged in talking with a child who's telling about an abuse experience, whether that's physical abuse or sexual abuse. And as a crisis helper, you might be working in an after-school program, you might be coaching gymnastics like Kelly does, you might be visiting with a family member and a child starts to tell you about something that's happening to him or her. So it's not really that you would have to be working in an elementary school with children to hear stories about children who are being abused, sadly. So I'm just emphasizing that it could be a crisis experience that you might have. Always, we're using the ABC model as we talk in this class about responding to crises. So again, with the A portion of the ABC response, we want to make connection to the child. This, or to the person who's reporting this to us, if it's an adult. Again, being empathic, making reflections, validating how they feel, validating their fears or their rage, letting the client know that we really want to be there and be behind them to support them as they, describe this experience and work through this experience. Also, in the B section, the boiling it down, if you will, we are again still looking for thoughts. And I guess I would say if we were working with a young child, to get to their to track their cognitive thoughts related to this might be a little more, I don't know if it's more difficult, but it might be a little more assumptive. We might not say to the child, so what are you telling yourself about this experience, Joey? And kids just don't talk like that. So what we might have to say is, tell me more about it. What do you think about it? What were you thinking when that happened? Gosh, what did you think about that? And you might get to some of those kinds of cognitive key cognitions, by using those sorts of statements with a child. And then finally with C, we're still using our resources to try to figure out how a client makes themselves feel better. And even with a child, we can, ask them, what do you do when you're feeling really sad or when you're feeling really scared? And they might say, I always go and jump in my mommy's lap. Or they might say, I go get my blankie. Or if it's a little bit older child, they might say, well, I just go play video games and I feel better after a while. So we do want to investigate coping that the child has used, and then try to help them with some new ideas about coping. In general, I want to talk with you about the types of child abuse that are covered in this chapter. There are 4 general types of child abuse. The first one is physical abuse, which of course is defined by a child's tissues or bones being damaged from hitting or knocking down or pushing or punching or any of the kinds of violent behaviors they might have directed at them. Under this category of physical abuse is where the sexual abuse is, it's not in the physical abuse category, it's its own category, sorry. So we have physical abuse, we have sexual abuse, we have just general neglect of a child, and then we have emotional abuse. And each of these types of abuse is defined and discussed in a little bit of detail in this chapter. I think we know what child sexual abuse is. I'll talk a little bit more about that specifically in a moment. And then when we're talking about general neglect, this is surrounding kids not being fed properly or not being supervised properly even. Sometimes children are not dressed as they need to be dressed. Maybe they're coming to school without underclothes on, or they might be coming to school in the winter on a rainy day and not have a coat. Some of these kinds of appearances can be just innocent and, something that a parent could have an answer for. But, I guess when we're working with children, what we're looking for is repeated hints that they might be being abused by just general neglect. And then emotional abuse is something that's really common. It's actually the most prevalent type of abuse, but the hardest one to prove. And the way that experts talk about emotional abuse is when a child is clearly being demeaned and picked on or put down or yelled at, and the parent is providing no love and support, just not connecting with the child at all. But also if a child is not allowed to develop a sense of self by not having any boundaries. They're not allowed to have certain feelings. They are not allowed to have their own personal space. They are not allowed to be in safety. These can be some ways that emotional abuse could be detected, I guess. There can also be some other outward clues, and there's a big laundry list of these. Look for the page. It's on page 191 of your textbook. And these are signs that I've read over years and years and years when talking about child abuse. So I'll just pick out a few of these as I look at the list. It's in box 9.7. Is habitually away from school and constantly late, arrives at school very early and leaves very late because the child does not want to go home. That could be a symptom. Is compliant or shy or withdrawn or passive, or even just not communicative at all, just shut down. Could be that a child wears long sleeve clothes even the hot times of the summer because they're covering up bruises. It could be that a child shows discomfort or pain when they're sitting down. So these are just some of the many bullet points that are listed in your textbook on page 191 that can be general symptoms of abuse. And then if you wrap over onto page 192, there's a box that of bullet points about that describe signs that a parent might be an abusive person. So I'll just hit a few of those with you. Shows little concern for his or her child's problems. Takes an unusual amount of time to seek health care for the child. Does not adequately explain an injury that the child has suffered. Maybe this person continues to complain about irrelevant problems unrelated to the injury if they're at the doctor's office. So I guess what I'm trying to maybe get to in talking about these bulleted lists is that if you're interacting with a child, let's say you're a classroom teacher or you work in an after-school program, or like Kelly, you're coaching kids and around kids all the time, you might notice repetitive, common behaviors that start to make you just wonder if the child is being abused or neglected or mistreated. And as a crisis interventionist, we might not be in the exact position to make that call, but we might be in the position to suggest that a report be made of suspected child abuse, and then usually someone from the Department of Social Services will be the social worker who's asked to come out and evaluate whether that is in fact what's happening. So it's important to just have in your mind maybe a list of things that could be signs and symptoms that a child is experiencing abuse. Let's see. Switching to abuse of a sexual nature of children, there are, as the book describes them, 4 presumptive signs. And so when I see the word presumptive, I guess I'm thinking I can presume that this is happening. Maybe that's the way they're using that phrase. And these 4 presumptive signs that a child is being sexually abused is, let's see, these are things that, let me get to that because all of a sudden I'm not seeing it. Okay, so, hold on. I can get this from the book, but I think I wrote it down in my notes. Yeah, so the 4 presumptive signs that a child might be experiencing sexual abuse is, number 1, if the child reports it to you, if the child tells you that it's happening. And sometimes a child will tell that. They might say, when I go to Grandpa's house, he touches me in my pee-pee. Or when we go to Aunt Sissy's house, she makes me take my underpants off. So those would be, statements that a child might make that tell you that something's happening. If a child becomes pregnant, so here we might think of it, I'm using the phrase child or the word child, so to me an 11 or 12 or maybe even 13-year-old person I could think of as a child. Now in the book they make the statement that you want to double check that this child is not having what might be considered appropriate sexual activity with peers. So we know, that 12 and 13-year-olds get pregnant, that happens, but if a child who's young is pregnant, we definitely want to check to see, who's having sex with them, right? Another one is venereal disease. If a child shows up with venereal disease or a discharge, especially if they're pre-adolescent, children don't get venereal disease. That's not a childhood illness. And so that's another one of the presumptive signs. And then the last one is children having genital injuries. So bruising around the anus or bruising in the vagina area or on the vulva could be signs of that. The book makes a very good point about the injuries, and that is that a child who's being sexually abused might not actually have physical injuries. And this is partly because people who often people who are predators to children in a sexual way, they do this by sort of not violently attacking a child, but they induce a child to participate in sexual activity. And so injury might not be, part of the picture here. These people will what's called groom a child, where they'll spend more time with the child, they'll give the child special treats, they'll treat the child as very particularly special compared with other children around. Then they start having secret games with the child. There's a whole kind of host of progressive behavior that is under the umbrella of grooming, but it sort of results in being able to take advantage of a child sexually. This can involve intercourse, but it could also involve oral sex. It could involve fondling. It could involve masturbation against a child. And so when we're looking for this presumptive piece of information, which is injuries, we just need to understand that injury might not necessarily be a part of this picture. And then let's see, there is a list on page 193 that are some noted common behaviors of kids who are probably being sexual or sexualized too early in life, and I'll just read the first 5 of those. Precocious sexual interest. So if a child in the 3rd grade is trying to, hump against another child and they make a big joke out of it, that's just not really typical childlike play. Or how about indiscreet masturbatory? Maybe a child's masturbating and they're being indiscreet about it. They're just doing it sort of on the playground or against another child. I kind of mentioned that already. Another thing is vaginal discharge. Apparent pain in sitting down or walking can be one of those signs. Fear and distrust of adults or authorities can be another one. And so all of these kinds of statements or occurrences or symptoms can be things that would alert us that a child has experienced probably some sexual assault or sexual misuse. Okay, I'm going to stop here with this chapter. I've realized as I'm talking about this stuff, I'm not doing a lot of smiling because it's not happy talk, that's for sure. But I do want to let you know that I'm thinking about you guys every day, all the time, because I still feel like I'm trying to be at work. So I'm keeping, as I've said to you before, I'm trying to keep my schedule up. I get up at this pretty much the same time, maybe 30 minutes later. I'm going out for my exercise and meditation time, and then when I come in, I immediately get to work. And so I just want you to know that I'm thinking about us as a class and that we have a flow of our work day. And for me, that usually is, during the day at school. And so I'm trying to keep that schedule and just be involved with work activities until about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. Sometimes I'm picking it up at night like you would, but I just want you to know that you're on my mind, and not just about the academic stuff, but I wonder about you. I wonder, how has your work situation changed? Some of you are not working because you've been laid off. Some of you have gone back to where your parents are. I'm noticing that that's a behavior for many of our young students because families want to be together. So I just realized that you're probably under increased stress, and I just want you to know that I recognize that so much. And please reach out to me privately through email if there's something that I can help you with, or if there's something about a deadline that I can help you with. I just really want to make sure that I do that. So take good care of yourselves, and I'll be seeing you soon in another recording.